Hello, welcome again to our Why Study series, and with me is Dr. Francis Knight, who's going to explore the importance of a 19th century Anglican cleric, FD Maurice. Francis, you're very welcome. Why is FD Maurice so important?
Well, I think he's important and deserving of a film today because he is unjustly neglected. Anglicans, it seems to me, are not very good at celebrating their theologians. Anglicans don't have equivalent figures to Luther, Calvin, John Wesley, and perhaps this is because Anglicans don't want to put particular emphases on particular individuals. But FD Maurice, it seems to me, is one of the major theologians of the 19th century and one whose impact has continued to be extremely important up to the present. I mean, the other theologian, the other big 19th century theologian that people may have heard of course, is John Henry Newman. And John Henry Newman and FD Maurice seem to me in some respects to be equivalent figures. But FD Maurice is the one who is seldom thought of and I think unjustly neglected. So I'm going to revive him today.
And of course, John Henry Newman has just been made a blessed for Roman Catholics, and so has been made sort of a, he's been given the whole razzle-dazzle effect. Everyone knows this name. But F.D. Maurice, yes, as you say, unjustly neglected. Okay, tell me some things about him.
Yes, as you say, Newman has had a huge amount of extraordinary afterlife, which I think Maurice hasn't had. Well, Maurice is, interestingly, like Newman, a convert. Newman, of course, famously converts to Roman Catholicism when he's in his mid-40s, but Maurice also is a convert to Anglicanism from Unitarianism, and he converts at the age of 26, so he's obviously much younger, but still old enough, of course, to have made a mature decision that Unitarianism was limited and that Anglicanism was actually offered a fuller expression of Christianity. And very interestingly, he converts in 1831, when one could say that the Church of England was at its most vulnerable in the 19th century. It was really not a good time for it at all. 1831 is the year in which the Bishop of Bristol is burnt in effigy. It's the period just before the Great Reform Act. And so his decision to join the Church of England at that point is an interesting one. Now, he is a theologian who is perhaps remembered for questioning the doctrine of eternal damnation. That would be one of his major contributions. He denied the doctrine of eternal damnation, and that caused him to be sacked from his post as a professor at King's College London. And he knew, in a sense, he knew that he was courting martyrdom when he wrote the theological essays which he wrote in 1853, in which he denied the doctrine of eternal damnation, which he thought was incompatible with the notion of the fatherhood of God and the notion of God as a loving father. And in actually raising these issues, he sets Anglicanism on a different course, and his views on that are picked up by many other people. But he's more than a theologian. He also has a massive interest in social questions, and much of the social thinking which Anglicanism and also nonconformity take up later in the 19th century and before and beyond is directly attributable to F.D. Maurice's thinking. So although he's extremely important in his own right, he has a massive impact on the next generation of thinkers. The thing which has struck me very forcibly, working on people in the late 19th century, just need to bear in mind that Maurice dies in 1872, so he isn't a late 19th, he's a mid-19th century figure, not a late 19th century figure. But almost every theologian that I've been looking at in recent times in the late 19th century, primary influence is F.D. Maurice, both in terms of his theology and his social thinking.
In terms of his theology, it's very easy for us to forget today that a very standard way of preaching Christianity until well into the 19th century in the mainline churches was, of course, that what's the use and purpose of religion? Oh, it is that which will save you from hell. And it's now taken for granted, I think, in most churches that that is, number one, not a good way to preach. It turns religion into some sort of bargaining with God. And also, it just doesn't reflect the New Testament message. But for someone like FD Maurice, this is not only something very new, but actually a very dangerous thing to be preaching.
It was a very brave thing to be preaching. And he was seen as vulnerable, and he was sacked by the Council of King's College London because, of course, as a professor at King's, he was in a position to influence students, many of whom go on to be clergymen. And the feeling that somebody with his views should be in such an influential position was seen in the 1850s as unacceptable.
When you say that he had a major influence as a theologian, who are the next generation who look back to him as their quasi-leader?
People like Charles Gore, Westcott, Hort, a whole variety of people, and into the 20th century, the sort of current generation of theologians and those in the middle of the 20th century, people like Michael Ramsey and others would look back to FD Maurice. Perhaps worth also saying something about FD Maurice's important contribution to Anglican theology, although I would want to make the point that his influence spreads beyond Anglicanism, certainly into nonconformity, although not into Roman Catholicism, I don't think. But in terms of Anglican theology, one of the important points he makes is he actually writes a publication on the dangers of joining a church party. He believes that the strength of Anglicanism is when all the various groupings, parties, schools of thought, whatever you want to call it, within Anglicanism, when the best is taken from them and they try and cooperate with each other. He was really against the notion that you should promote only the kind of theology that you like. And I think that is a really useful insight in the current world, where we see a lot of people promoting the kind of theology that they like. He obviously knew what he liked and what he thought was theologically helpful, but he also knew that there were other things in other traditions that should be listened to. And he believed that the unique genius, as it were, to use it in that word in its correct sense, of Anglicanism was the various Anglo-Catholic, evangelical, liberal streams of thought actually working together and influencing each other. And so at a time when Anglicanism was becoming very polarised, with the Oxford movement on one end and the evangelicals on the other, he actually stood out strongly against that notion of party.
And does he actually recognise that factionalism, apart from being sort of unbecoming in a group that claims to be a community of love, is actually a theologically problematic way to proceed? That the more any theology becomes factional, the more it tends to lose the complexity of the Christian vision.
Yes, yes he does. And so I think it's important to see him as a forerunner of ecumenism, actually. You know, we tend to think of ecumenism as something which dates from the early 20th century, but actually one of his early publications, The Kingdom of God, has the seeds of ecumenism clear.
One other point you made earlier, and that is that he had an immense impact on social thinking. Could you just say a little bit about that impact?
That's probably what he's best known for, actually. He was involved in the first wave of Christian socialism, which is 1848, the time of the Chartist uprising, until 1854. And he's involved with Charles Kingsley, and another quite famous Anglican cleric, and J.M. Ludlow and various others, in trying to improve, making practical measures to improve social conditions. And he's also heavily interested in adult education, and actually adult education and the founding of the Working Men's College, which still exists and claims to be the oldest institution of its type in Europe, is perhaps one of his greatest legacies.
Well, Francis, Anglicanism may not have the mechanisms for beatifying or canonising its theologians of the past, but I hope this video has gone some way to rescuing FD Maurice from oblivion.
I hope so too.
I hope that this has been an interesting insight into a very important theologian. Thank you for watching.